I call on Consul of the United States.
To the tribunal, please. When Your Honors adjourned on 20 December, we were presenting the Gestapo and had referred to the use of the death vans by the Einsatzgruppen in the eastern occupied countries and had almost concluded that phase of the presentation. The Honors will recall we had referred to the use of some death vans made by the Sauer Works. And the final reference that I want to make in that connection is to a telegram attached to document 501 PS, which is not necessary to read, which establishes the fact that the same make of trucks or vans were the death vans used by the Einsatzgruppen. The final document in connection with the Einsatzgruppen in the eastern occupied territories we desire to offer is document 2992 PS. And I believe it's in the second volume of the document book. This is an affidavit made by Herman Graebe. Herman Graebe is at present employed by the United States government at Frankfurt. The affidavit was made at Wiesbaden, and I offer excerpts from affidavit 2992 PS, U.S. Exhibit 494. This witness was at the head of a construction firm that was doing some building in the Ukraine, and he was an eyewitness to the anti-Jewish actions at the town of Rono, Ukraine, on 13 July 1942. And I refer to the part of the affidavit which is on page 5 of the English translation, 2992, beginning at the first. From September 1941 until January 1944, I was manager and engineer in charge of a branch office in Storey, Ukraine, of the Solingen building firm of Joseph Jung. In this capacity, it was my job to visit the building sites of the firm. The firm had, amongst others, a site in Rono, Ukraine. During the night of 13 July 1942, all inhabitants of the Rono ghetto, where there were still about 5,000 Jews, were liquidated. I would describe the circumstances of my being a witness of the dissolution of the ghetto and the carrying out of the pogrom during the night and the morning as follows. I employed for the firm in Rono, in addition to Poles, Germans, and Ukrainians, about 100 Jews from Stolbino, Ostrog, and Mysoch. The men were quartered in a building, 5 Bahnhofstrasse, inside the ghetto, and the women in a house at the corner of the Deutsche Strasse, 98. On Saturday, 11 July 1942, my foreman, Fritz Einsporn, told me of a rumor that on Monday, all Jews in Rono were to be liquidated. Although the vast majority of the Jews employed by my firm in Rono were not natives of this town, I still feared that they might be included in this pogrom which had been reported. I therefore ordered Einsatzgruppen at noon of the same day to march all the Jews employed by us, men as well as women, in the direction of Storey, about 12 kilometers from Rono. This was done. The senior Jew had learned of the departure of the Jewish workers of my firm. He went to see the commanding officer of the Rono Seapole and SD, SS Major, SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Poots, as early as the Saturday afternoon to find out whether the rumor of a forthcoming Jewish pogrom, which had gained further credence by reason of the departure of Jews of my firm, was true. Dr. Poots dismissed the rumor as a clumsy lie, and for the rest had the Polish personnel of my firm in Rono arrested. Einsatzgruppen avoided arrest by escaping from Storey. When I learned of this incident, I gave orders that all Jews who had left Rono were to report back to work at Rono on Monday, 13 July, 1942. On Monday morning, I myself went to see the commanding officer, Dr. Poots, in order to learn, for one thing, the truth about the rumored Jewish pogrom, and secondly, to obtain information on the arrest of the Polish office personnel. SS Major Poots stated to me that no pogrom whatever was planned. Moreover, such a pogrom would be stupid, because the firms and the Reichsbahn would lose valuable workers. An hour later, I received a summons to appear before the area commissioner of Rono. His deputy, Stableiter, and cadet officer, Beck, subjected me to the same questions as I had undergone at the SD. My explanation that I had sent the Jews home for urgent delousing appeared plausible to him. He then told me, making me promise to keep it a secret, that a pogrom would in fact take place in the evening of Monday, 13 July, 1942. After lengthy negotiation, I managed to persuade him to give me permission to take my Jewish workers to Storey, but only after the pogrom had been carried out. During the night, it would be up to me to protect the house in the ghetto against the entry of Ukrainian militia and SS. As confirmation of the discussion, he gave me a document which stated that the Jewish employees of Messrs. Jung were not affected by the pogrom. And this original, which I hold in my hand, I'll now pass to the translator for reading. And I call the attention of your honors to the fact that it has the letterhead of Der Gebietskommissar in Rono. That's the area commissar. And it's dated the 13th of July, 1942. And it's signed by this area commissioner. And I now read. I have it here. I now read this document. The area commissioner, which means Gebietskommissar Rono, secret, addressed Messrs. Jung, Rono. The Jewish workers employed by... I beg your pardon, this part is previous to that on page 4 of the English translation. It's just the page before. I continue reading. The Jewish workers employed by your firm are not affected by the pogrom, in parenthesis, action. As I understand, that means action. You must transfer them to their new place of work by Wednesday, 15 July, 1942 at the latest. Signed by the area commissioner, Beck, and then the stamp, the official stamp of the area commissioner, at Rono. Now, just the following paragraph on the original page 5, or 6, I believe it is. There's one more paragraph I'd like to read after the reference, original attached. On the evening of this day, I drove to Rono and posted myself with Fritz Einsporn in front of the house in the Bahnhofstrasse in which the Jewish workers of my firm slept. Shortly after 2200, the ghetto was encircled by a large SS detachment and about 3 times as many members of the Ukrainian militia. Then the electric arc lights which had been erected in and around the ghetto were switched on. SS and militia squads of 4 to 6 men entered or at least tried to enter the houses, where the doors and windows were closed and the inhabitants did not open at the knocking. The SS men and militia broke the windows, forced the doors with beams and crowbars, and entered the houses. The people living there were driven onto the street just as they were, regardless of whether they were dressed or in bed. Since the Jews in most cases refused to leave their houses and resisted, the SS and militia applied force. They finally succeeded, with strokes of the whips, kicks, and blows with rifle butts in clearing the houses. The people were driven out of their houses in such haste that small children in bed had been left behind in several instances. In the street, women cried out for their children, and the children for their parents. That did not prevent the SS from driving the people along the road at running pace and hitting them until they reached a waiting freight train. Car after car was filled, and the screaming of women and children and the cracking of whips and rifle shots resounded unceasingly. Since several families or groups had barricaded themselves in especially strong buildings, and the doors could not be forced with crowbars or beams, these houses were now blown open with hand grenades. Since the ghetto was near the railroad tracks in Rono, the younger people tried to get across the tracks and over a small river, it's blotted out here, get away from the ghetto area. As this stretch of country was beyond the range of the electric lights, it was illuminated by small rockets. All through the night, these beaten, hounded, and wounded people moved along the lighted streets. Women carried their dead children in their arms. Children pulled and dragged their dead parents and their arms and legs down the road toward the train. Again and again, the cries, open the door, echoed through the ghetto," unquote. I'll not read any more of this affidavit. It's a very long one. There's also a second affidavit. But the part I wanted to emphasize is the fact that the original exemption was signed by the area commissioner and that the SD and the SS participated in this action.
Wouldn't you to read the rest of that page, Colonel Storey?
All right, sir. I really had eliminated that because I thought there might be some repetition. About 6 o'clock in the morning, I went away for a moment, leaving behind Einsporn and several other German workers who had returned in the meantime. I thought the greatest danger was past and that I could risk it. Shortly after I left, Ukrainian militiamen forced their way into 5 Bahnhofstrasse and brought 7 Jews out and took them to a collecting point inside the ghetto. On my return, I was able to prevent further Jews from being taken out. I went to the collecting point to save these 7 men. I saw dozens of corpses of all ages and both sexes in the streets. I had to walk along. The doors of the houses stood open. Windows were smashed. Pieces of clothing, shoes, stockings, jackets, caps, hats, coats, etc., were lying in the street. At the corner of a house lay a baby, less than a year old, with his skull crushed. Blood and brains were spattered over the house wall and covered the area immediately around the child. The child was dressed only in a little shirt. The commander, SS Major Poots, was walking up and down a row of about 80 to 100 male Jews who were crouching on the ground. He had a heavy dog whip in his hand. I walked up to him, showed him the written permit of Stabsleiter Beck, and demanded the 7 men whom I recognized among those who were crouching on the ground. Dr. Poots was very furious about Beck's concession, and nothing could persuade him to release the 7 men. He made a motion with his hand encircling the square and said that anyone who was once here would not get away. Although he was very angry with Beck, he ordered me to take the people from 5 Bahnhofstrasse out of Rono by 8 o'clock at the latest. When I left Dr. Poots, I noticed a Ukrainian farm cart with 2 horses. Dead people with stiff limbs were lying on the cart, legs and arms projected over the sideboards. The cart was making for the freight train. I took the remaining 74 Jews who had been locked in the house to Storey. Several days after the 13th of July, 1942, the area commissioner of Storey, George Marshall, called a meeting of all firm managers, railroad superintendents, and leaders of the organization Todt, and informed them that the farms, etc., should prepare themselves for the resettlement. He referred to the pogrom in Rono, where all the Jews had been liquidated, that is, had been shot near Kostolpol. Finally, his signature and sworn to on the 10th of November, 1945.
What's the nationality? Is Graebe.
He is the German. Graebe was the German.
Yes.
And is now in the employ of military government at Frankfurt, the United States military government. Your Honor, in that connection, there's another separate affidavit attached to this, which is a part of the same document, which I'll not attempt to read, but it has to do with the execution of some people in another area and is along the same line. And I'm not reading it because it would be cumulative, but it is a part of this same document. I now pass from that subject to the next subject. The Gestapo and SD stationed special units in prisoner of war camps for the purpose of screening out racial and political undesirables and executing those who were screened out. The program of mass murder of political and racial undesirables carried on against civilians was also applied to prisoners of war who were captured on the Eastern Front. In this connection, I call attention of the tribunal to the testimony of General Lahousen, which Your Honors will recall on the 30th of November, 1945. Lahousen testified to a conference which took place in the summer of 1941, shortly after the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union, which was attended by himself. And I want to emphasize this because he will later have a document that emanated from this conference. Attended by himself, General Reinecke, Colonel Brewer, and Muller, the head of the Gestapo. At this conference, the command to kill Soviet functionaries and communists among the Soviet prisoners of war was discussed. The executions were to be carried out by Einsatzkommandos of the SIPO and the SD. Lahausen further recalled that Muller, who was the head of the Gestapo, insisted on carrying out the program, and that the only concession he made was that in deference to the sensibilities of the German troops, the executions would not take place in the presence of the troops. Muller also made some concessions as to the selection of the persons to be murdered. But according to Lahausen, the selection was left entirely to the commanders of these screening units. I refer to page 633 of the official transcript. Now I offer document 502 PS as the next exhibit, U.S. Exhibit 486. This document is a Gestapo directive, 502 PS in the first document book. This document is a Gestapo directive of the 17th of July, 1941. If you'll recall, Lahausen said this conference is in the summer of 41. Addressed to commandos of the SIPO and SD stationed in camps, and provides in part as follows, and I read from the first page of English translation. Now, if the tribunal please, our colleagues, the Soviet prosecutors, will present most of that document, and I'm only going to read enough to show that the Gestapo were the ones that took part in it from the beginning. The activation of commandos will take place in accordance with the agreement of the Chief of the Security Police and Security Service and the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces as of 16 July 1941, Enclosure 1. The commandos will work independently according to special authorization and in consequence of the general regulations given to them in the limits of the camp organizations. Naturally, the commandos will keep close contact with the camp commander and the defense officers assigned to him. The mission of the commandos is the political investigating of all camp inmates, the elimination and further treatment, A, of all political, criminal, or in some way other unbearable elements among them, B, of those persons who could be used for the reconstruction of the occupied countries. Now I skip to the beginning of the fourth paragraph. The commandos must use for their work, as far as possible at present and even later, the experiences of the camp commanders which the latter have collected meanwhile from observation of the prisoners and examination of the camp inmates. Further, the commandos must make efforts from the beginning to seek out among the prisoners elements which would appear reliable, regardless if they are communist concerned or not, in order to use them for intelligence purposes inside of the camp, and if advisable, later in the occupied territories also. By use of such informers, and by use of all other existing possibilities, the discovery of all elements to be eliminated among the prisoners must succeed step by step at once. The commandos must learn for themselves in every case, by means of short questioning of the informers and eventual questioning of other prisoners. The information of one informer is not sufficient to designate a camp inmate to be a suspect without further proof it must be confirmed in some way if possible. Now I skip to page 2, the third paragraph of the English translation. Quoting, "Executions are not to be held in the camp or in the immediate vicinity of the camp. If the camps in the general government are in the immediate vicinity of the border, then the prisoners are to be taken for special treatment, if possible, into the former Soviet Russian territory." And then the fifth paragraph, quoting, "In regard to executions to be carried out and to the possible removal of reliable civilians and the removal of informers for the Einsatzgruppen in the occupied territories, the leader of the Einsatzkommando must make an agreement with the nearest state police office, as well as with the commandant of the security police unit and security service, and beyond these, with the chief of the Einsatzgruppen concerned in the occupied territories," unquote. Proof that persons so screened out of the prisoner of war camps by the Gestapo were executed is to be found in document 1165 PS, which I did not intend to quote from and which has been previously introduced as U.S. Exhibit 244. Document 1165 PS, which shows that they were executed, those who had been screened out. The first page of that document, without reading it, is a letter from the camp commandant of the concentration camp Gross Rosen to Muller, who was the chief of the Gestapo, dated the 23rd of October 1941, referring to previous oral conference with Muller and setting forth the names of 20 Soviet prisoners of war executed the previous day. The second page, I'm still referring to 1165, but not reading from it because it's been quoted from. The second page is a directive issued by Muller on the 9th of November 1941 to all Gestapo offices, in which he ordered that all diseased prisoners of war should be excluded from transports to concentration camps for execution, because 5 to 10% of those destined for execution were arriving in the camps dead or half dead. I now offer document 2542 PS, U.S. Exhibit 489. 2542 in second volume. This is an affidavit of Kurt Lendo, a former Gestapo official, which was taken on the 30th of September 1945 at Oberrussel, Germany, in the course of an official military investigation by the United States Army. And I quote from that document from the beginning, quoting, "I was criminal director in Section 4 of the RSHA, and I call Your Honor's attention to the chart on the board that he was criminal director of Section 4 and head of the subsection of 4A1 from the middle of 1942 until the middle of 1944. I have the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. From 1941 until the middle of 1943, there was attached to subsection 4A1, which is not shown on this chart but previously been described in the beginning, as a special department that was headed by Regierungsbeherinspector, later Regierungsruhen Amtmann, and SS Hauptsturmbannführer Franz Konighaus. In this department were handled matters concerning prisoners of war. I learned from this department that instructions and orders by Reichsfuhrer Himmler, dating from 1941 and 1942, existed, according to which captured Soviet Russian political commissars and Jewish soldiers were to be executed. As far as I know, proposals for execution of such prisoners of war were received from the various PW camps. Konighaus had to prepare the orders for execution and submitted them to the chief of Section 4, Muller, for his signature, Muller being the head of the Gestapo. These orders were made out so that one order was to be sent to the agency making the request, and a second one to the concentration camp designated to carry out the execution. The PWs in question were at first formally released from PW status and then transferred to a concentration camp for execution. The department chief, Konighaus, was under me in disciplinary questions from the middle of 1942 until about the beginning of 1943, and worked in matters of his department directly with the chief of Group 4A, Regierungsrat Panzinger. Early 1943, the department was dissolved and absorbed into the departments in subsection 4B. The work concerning Russian PWs must then have been done by 4B2A. Head of the department 4B2A was Regierungsrat and Sturmbannführer Hans Helmut Wolf. There existed in the PW camps on the Eastern Front small screening teams, Einsatzkommandos, headed by a lower-ranking member of the secret police, or Gestapo. These teams were assigned to the camp commanders and had the job to segregate the PWs who were candidates for execution according to the orders that had been given, and to report them to the office of the secret police, unquote. I'll not read the remainder of that affidavit. Passing from that phase of the case, the next subject is the Gestapo and SD sent recaptured prisoners of war to concentration camps where they were executed. That is, prisoners of war who had escaped and recaptured. The tribunal will recall in a document heretofore introduced, 1650 PS, was an order which the chief of the security police and SD instructed regional Gestapo offices to make certain classes of recaptured officers from camps and to transport them to Mauthausen concentration camp under the operation known as Kugel, K-U-G-E-L. That, if Your Honor recalls, means bullet. That is the famous bullet decree that's been previously introduced. On the journey, the prisoners of war were to be placed in arms. The Gestapo officers were to make semi-annual reports, giving numbers only of the sending of these prisoners of war to Mauthausen. On the 27th of July, 1944, an order was issued from the 6th Corps Area Command on the treatment of prisoners of war. And that is document 1514 PS in the second volume, which I offer as U.S. Exhibit 491. What's wrong? This document, which provided that prisoners of war were to be discharged from prisoner of war status and transferred to the Gestapo under certain circumstances, and I quote from the first page, beginning with the word subject. Quoting, subject, delivery of prisoners of war to the secret state police. Enclosed is the decree one referred to. The following summarized ruling is issued with respect to the delivery to the secret police. 1A. According to the decrees 2 and 3, the commander of the camp has to deliver Soviet prisoners of war in case of punishable offenses to the secret state police and to dismiss them from imprisonment of war if he does not believe that his disciplinary functions suffice to prescribe punishment for violations committed. Report of the facts is not necessary. B. Recaptured Soviet prisoners of war have to be delivered first to the nearest police office in order to ascertain whether punishable offenses have been committed during their escape. The dismissal from imprisonment of war takes place upon suggestion of the police office, section A6 of the decree referred to in number 4. Regarding the contraction of all regulations on the Arbeitseinsatz prisoners of war who have been recaptured and refused to work. C. Recaptured Soviet officers who are prisoners of war have to be delivered to the Gestapo and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war, citing the sections. D. Soviet prisoners of war who refuse to work and those who distinguish themselves as agitators have an unfavorable influence upon the willingness to work of the other prisoners of war have to be delivered by the responsible stalag to the nearest state police office and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war, citing the appropriate section. E.
I think you left out the word officer there, didn't you? Soviet officer prisoners of war.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Soviet officer prisoners of war. E. Soviet enlisted prisoners of war refusing to work who are ringleaders and those who distinguish themselves as agitators and therefore have an unfavorable influence upon the willingness to work of the other prisoners of war have to be delivered to the nearest state police office and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war. F. Soviet prisoners of war, enlisted men and officers who, with respect to their political attitude, have been sifted out by the Special Purpose Command, Einsatzkommando of the Security Police and the Security Service, have to be delivered upon request by the camp commander to the Special Purpose Command and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war. G. Polish prisoners of war have to be delivered, if the acts of sabotage are proven, to the nearest state police office and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war. The decision rests with the camp commander. Report of the deed is not necessary. a report on the delivery and dismissal from imprisonment of war in cases mentioned number 1 of this decree to the Military District Command 6, Department of Prisoners of War, is not necessary. Prisoners of war from all nations have to be delivered to the secret state police and to be dismissed from imprisonment of war if a special order of the OKV or of the Military District Command 6, Department for Prisoners of War, is issued. Prisoners of war under suspicion of participating in illegal organizations and resistance movements have to be left upon request to the Gestapo for the purpose of interrogation. They remain prisoners of war and have to be treated as such. The delivery to the Gestapo and their dismissal from imprisonment of war has to take place only by order of the OKV or of the Military District Command 6, Department of Prisoners of War. In case of French and Belgian prisoners of war and interned Italian military personnel, approval of Military District Command 6, Department of Prisoners of War, has to be obtained, if necessary, by phone before delivery to the Gestapo for the purposes of interrogation, unquote. This decree was known as the Bullet Decree. Prisoners of war sent to Mauthausen concentration under the decree were executed. I now offer, in support of that statement, document 2285 PS, U.S. Exhibit 490. It's in the second volume. This is an affidavit, document 2285 PS. This is an affidavit of Lieutenant Colonel Jouvent de Saint-Gast and Lieutenant Jean Bate, both of the French Army, which was taken on the 13th of May, 1945, in the course of an official military investigation by the U.S. Army. The affidavit discloses that Lieutenant Colonel Gast was confined at Mauthausen from 18 March 1944 until 22nd April 1945, and that Lieutenant Bate was confined from 22 April 43 until 22 April 1945. I quote from the affidavit beginning with the third paragraph of page 1. Quoting, "In Mauthausen existed several treatments of prisoners, amongst them the action K or Kugel, bullet action. Upon the arrival of transports, prisoners with the mention K were not registered, got no numbers, and their names remained unknown except for the officials of the Politische Abteilung. Lieutenant Bate had the opportunity of hearing, upon the arrival of a transport, the following conversation between the Untersturmführer Streiweiser and chief of the convoy. Quote, "How many prisoners?" Question. 15, but 2 K, the letter K. Answer, well, that makes 13, unquote. The prisoners were taken directly to the prison, where they were unclothed and taken to the bathrooms in quotation. This bathroom in the cellar of the prison building near the crematory was specially designed for execution, shooting, and gassing. The shooting took place by means of a measuring apparatus. The prisoners being backed towards a metrical measure with an automatic contraption, releasing a bullet in his neck as soon as the moving plank determining his height touched the top of his head. If a transport consisted of too many K prisoners, instead of losing time for the measurement, they were exterminated by gas sent into the bathrooms instead of water, unquote. I now pass to another subject, namely the Gestapo was responsible for establishing and classifying concentration camps and for committing racial and political undesirables to concentration and annihilation camps for slave labor and mass murder. The tribunal has already received evidence concerning the responsibility of the Gestapo for the administration of concentration camps and the authority of the Gestapo for taking persons into protective custody to be carried out in the state concentration camps. The Gestapo also issued orders establishing concentration camps, transforming prisoner of war camps into concentration camps as internment camps, changing labor camps into concentration camps, setting up special sections for female prisoners, and so forth. The chief of the security police and SD ordered the classification of concentration camps according to the seriousness of the accusation and the chances for reforming the prisoners from the Nazi viewpoint. I now refer to document 1063A and B in the second volume, U.S. Exhibit 492. The concentration camps were classified as classes 1, 2, or 3. Class 1 was for the least serious prisoners, and Class 3 was the most serious. Now, this document, 1063A, is signed by Heydrich, and it is dated the 2nd of January 1941. And I quote from the beginning with the word subject. Subject: classification of the concentration camps. The Reichsfuhrer SS and chief of the German police has given his approval to classify the concentration camps. Did you find it, John? Into various categories which take into account the personality of the prisoner as well as the degree of his danger to the state. Accordingly, the concentration camps will be classified into the following categories. Category 1, for all prisoners with only little accusation and definitely qualified for correction. Also for special cases and solitary confinements, camps Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Auschwitz. Auschwitz I, Lieutenant Harris calls my attention to. The latter also applies in part to Category 2. Category 1A, for all old prisoners and conditionally qualified for work, who can still be used in the medicinal herb gardens, the Camp Dachau. Category 2, for prisoners with heavy accusations, but still qualified for reduction, re-education, and correction, the camps Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Auschwitz II. Category 3, and I call Your Honor's attention, we've been talking about Mauthausen, where the K action took place. For the heavily accused prisoners, at the same time also for those who have been previously convicted for criminal offenses. For social prisoners, that is to say, those who can hardly be corrected, the Camp Mauthausen, and unquote. The chief of the security police and SD had authority to fix the length of the period of custody. During the war, it was the policy not to permit the prisoners to know the period of the custody and merely to announce the term as, quote, until further notice, unquote. And that was established by document 1531 PS, which has previously been introduced as U.S. Exhibit 248. And the only reason for referring to it is to show that they had the right to fix the length of period of custody. The local Gestapo offices which made the arrest maintained a register called the Hauptbach. And digressing from the text, as I understand, Hauptbach simply means a blotter or a police register. And in this register, the names of all persons arrested were listed, together with personal data, grounds of arrest, and disposition. When orders were received from the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin to commit persons who had been arrested to concentration camps, an entry was made in the Haftbuch to that effect. Now, I offer in evidence the original of one of these books, and it is L358, U.S. Exhibit 495. This book was captured by the Third Army when it overran collected by the Third Army when it overran an area, and it is captured by the T Force on April 22nd, 1945, near Bad Sulza, S-U-L-Z-A, Germany. Now, this book is the original register used by the Gestapo at Tomassow, T-O-M-A-S-S-O-W, Poland, to record the names of the persons arrested, the grounds for arrest, and disposition made of cases during the period from 1 June 1943 to the 20th of December 1944. In the register are approximately 3,500 names of persons. Approximately 2,200 were arrested for membership in the resistance movement and partisan units. This is a very large book, and I'm going to ask the clerk to pass it to Your Honors so that you might get a look at it. It's too big to photograph. And if your honors will just turn to one of the pages, I'll read what the different columns provide. Just any one of the pages, it's a double column. Starts on the left and goes over to the other side. In the first column, that heading is simply a number of the man when he comes in. The next column is his name. The third column is the brief family history and his religion. The fourth is the domicile. The next shows the date he was arrested and by whom. That's the fifth column. The next column, the place of arrest. And then the next column, the reason for arrest. And then the next is another number, which is apparently a serial number for delivery. And next to the last column is the disposition. And the final column, remarks. Now, out of the 3,500 names that are shown in that book, your honors will notice a number of red marks. Those apparently meant the ones that were shot. Of these, 325 were shot. Only 35 of that 325 had first been tried. 950 out of this list were sent to concentration camps, and 155 sent to the Reich for forced labor. According to this register, some others were arrested. For instance, communists, Jews, hostages, and persons taken in reprisal. A large number are shown to have been arrested during raids, no further grounds being stated. I particularly refer your honors to entries 286, 287, and 288. That's the number in the first column, 286, 287, and 288. Of the register where the crime charged to the person arrested was, quote, als Juden, unquote. In other words, he was a Jew. And by that you will find a red cross mark, and the punishment given was death under items 286, 287, and 288. This document I now pass from this document and simply call attention to document L2215, which was heretofore introduced as U.S. Exhibit 243. I don't intend to read from it, and unless your honors want to turn L215. This is a file of original dossiers on 25 Luxembourgers taken into protective custody for commitment to concentration camps. I'll just refer to a sentence of the language in that document, quoting, "According to the finding of the state police, he endangers by his attitude the existence and security of the people and the state," unquote. And in each case, with reference to those dossiers, that appears as being the reason for the execution of these 25 Luxembourgers. Document L215. And in connection with...
Colonel Storey, you said execution, did you not?
I beg your pardon, to the concentration camps.
Yes. There's no evidence there that they were executed.
No, sir, they were committed to the concentration camps. And also, in connection with that same document, there is a form provided by which the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin were notified when the persons were received by the concentration camps. Another document which has heretofore been received as U.S. Exhibit 279, document 1472 PS. In the second volume, I'm simply going to refer to it as a predicate for another. That was a telegram of 16 December 1942 in which Muller reported that the Gestapo could round up some 45,000 Jews in connection with the program of obtaining additional labor in concentration camps. And with reference to the same subject, document 1063 D.P.S., which was heretofore offered as Exhibit 219, Muller sent a directive to the commanders and inspectors of the security police and SD and to the directors of the Gestapo regional offices, in which he stated that Himmler had ordered on 14 December 42 that at least 35,000 persons who were fit for work had to be put into concentration camps not later than the end of January. Now, in that same connection, I offer document L41. Volume 1, L41, as U.S. Exhibit 496. This document contains a further directive from Muller dated the 23rd of March, 1943, and supplements the directive of 17 December 1942, to which I referred, and in which he states that the measures are to be carried out until 30 April 1943. And I'd like to quote from the second paragraph on page 3 of the exhibit. Page 3 of the English translation of L41. Quoting, "Care must, however, be taken that only prisoners who are fit for work are transferred to concentration camps, and adolescents only in accordance with the given directives. Otherwise, the concentration camps would become overcrowded, and this would defeat the intended aim," unquote. In that same connection, I offer document 701 PS, U.S. Exhibit 497. This is a letter dated 1 April 1943 from the Minister of Justice to the public prosecutors and also addressed to the Commissioner of the Reich Minister of Justice for the penal camps in Emsland. Regarding Poles and Jews who are released from the penal institutions of the Department of Justice, instructions for the independent penal institutions. 1. With reference to the new guiding principles for the application of Article 1, Section 2 of the Decree of 11 June 1940, Reich Legal Gazette 1S 887, Attachment 1 of the Decree, RV of 27 January 1943, -9133-2, enclosure 13A2, 2629, the Reich Chief Security Office has directed by the decree of 11 March 1943, 2A2, number 100/43-176. A. Jews who, in accordance with number 6 of the guiding principles, are released from a penal institution are to be taken by the State Police Chief Office competent for the district in which the penal institution is located for the rest of their lives to the concentration camps Auschwitz or Lublin in accordance with the regulations for protective custody that have been issued. The same applies of Jews who in the future are released from a penal institution after serving a sentence of confinement. Poles who, in accordance with number 6 of the guiding principles, are released from a penal institution are to be taken by the State Police Chief Office competent for the district in which the penal institution is located for the duration of the war to a concentration camp in accordance with the regulations on protective custody that have been issued. The same applies in the future to Poles who, after serving a term of imprisonment of more than 6 months, are to be discharged by a penal institution. Conforming to the request of the Chief Office for Reich Security, I ask that in the future, A, all Jews to be discharged, B, all Poles to be discharged who have served a sentence of more than 6 months, be designated for further confinement to the State Police Chief Office competent for the district and are to be placed promptly at its disposal before the end of sentence for conveyance. Unquote. And the last paragraph states that the ruling replaces hitherto ordered return of all Polish prisoners undergoing imprisonment in the old Reich condemned in the annexed Eastern Territories. The next subject, the Gestapo and the SD participated in the deportation of citizens of occupied countries for forced labor and handled the disciplining of forced labor. With reference to the presentation heretofore made concerning forced labor, I do not intend to repeat. However, there were several references to important positions played by the Gestapo and the SD in rounding up persons to be brought into the Reich for forced labor, and references in 2 or 3 documents that were introduced, and I simply want to cite those documents as showing the part that the Gestapo and SD played. Document L-61, U.S. Exhibit 177. It's set out in this document book. I'm simply citing it. The letter of the 26th of November, 1942, from Fritz Sockel. That's the letter from Fritz Sockel, in which he stated that he had been advised by the Chief of the Security Police and SD under date of 26 October 1942 that during the month of November the evacuation of Poles in the Lublin district would begin in order to make room for the settlement of persons of the German race. The Poles were evacuated as a result of this measure, were to be put into concentration camps for labor, as far as they were criminal or antisocial. The tribunal will also recall the Christensen letter, which is our document 3012 PS, U.S. Exhibit 190. In that letter, it is stated during the year 1943, the program of mass murders carried out by the Einsatzgruppen in the East should be modified in order to round up hundreds of thousands of persons for labor in the armament industry. That was in 3012 PS, which has heretofore been introduced as U.S. Exhibit 190. And that force was to be used when necessary. Prisoners were to be released so they could be used for forced labor. When villages were burnt down, the whole population was to be placed at the disposal of the labor commissioners. Now, in that connection, the direct responsibility of the Gestapo for disciplining forced workers is shown in our next exhibit, 1573 PS, U.S. Exhibit 498. (1573 PS). This is a secret order signed by Muller himself to the regional Gestapo offices on the 18th of June, 1941, and I quote from the document from the beginning. It's addressed to all State Police administrative offices. To the State Police, attention SS Stundenführer Noski, our representative at Aachen. Subject: measures to be taken against immigrants and civilian workers who come from the great Russian areas and against foreign workers. Reference none. To prevent the unauthorized and arbitrary return of Russian, Ukrainian, White Ruthenian, Cossack, and Caucasian immigrants and civilian workers from the territory of the Reich to the east, and to prevent attempts at disorder by foreign workers in the German production, I decide as follows. 1. The managers of the branch offices of the Russian, Ukrainian, White Ruthenian, and Caucasians trustee office, as well as the relief committee and the batting members of the Russian, Ukrainian, White Ruthenian, Cossack, and Caucasian immigration organizations are to be notified immediately that they are not allowed to leave their domicile without permission of the security police until further notice. Also, they are told to apply the same measures to the members who are under their care. Their attention is to be called to the fact that they will be arrested because of unauthorized leaving of the place of work and domicile. I request you to have a checkup of the attendance of branch office leaders, if possible, by daily requests in these concerns. 2. Immigrants and foreign workers are to be arrested if it seems necessary in the situation, if there is no doubt of their guilt, and if they are under the suspicion of having been active for the USSR in transmitting news. The measure is to be in readiness, however. It should not be executed before the password Fremdelvölker, as has been transmitted by means of urgent telegram.
Is it necessary to read the rest of that?
Sir?
Is it necessary to read the rest of that
I don't
document?
think so, Your Honor. I'll pass that.
We'll adjourn now for 10 minutes.
Yes. Tribunal, please, I next offer in evidence document 3360 PS. 3360 PS, U.S. Exhibit 499 in the second volume. Before I hand this document to the translators, I should like to exhibit it to your honors. It's an original telegram that was sent to the Gestapo office at Nuremberg. It was captured or discovered by the CIC, a Lieutenant Stevens, near Herzbruck, Germany. And your honors will notice that parts of it have been burned. It was in connection with some documents that had been buried, and then they were partially burned when they were buried. And this is one of the telegrams. It's from the secret state police, the state police station at Nuremberg and Fürth. And it's dated the 12th of February, 1944. And I quote the telegram. RSHA Roman 4 F1 4544. The Border Inspector General, urgent, submit immediately. Treatment of recaptured, escaped Eastern laborers by order of the RFSS, that's the Reichsführer SS. All recaptured, escaped Eastern laborers, without exception, are to be sent to concentration camps, effective immediately. In regard to reporting to the RFSS, I request that only one report by teletype to Section Roman 4D of foreign laborers on 10 March 1944 as to how many of such male or female Eastern laborers were turned over to a concentration camp between today and 10 March 1944, unquote. By these methods, the Gestapo and SD maintained control over forced labor brought into the Reich. Now, the next subject that I go into is that the Gestapo and SD executed captured commandos and paratroopers and protected civilians who lynched Allied flyers. On the 4th of August, 1942, Keitel issued an order which provided that the SD and Gestapo were responsible for taking countermeasures against single parachutists or small groups of them with special missions. And in substantiation, I offer document 553 PS, U.S. Exhibit 500. 553 PS. And I quote from the first page of the translation, the first part of paragraph 3, quoting, "So far as single parachutists are captured by members of the armed forces, they are to be delivered to the nearest agency of the Chief of the Security Police and SD without delay." Now, if the tribunal please, in diverting from the text, Colonel Taylor will present the Nazi High Command, and there are a few of these orders, this is one and the next one, that he's going to deal with extensively, and my purpose in introducing these orders now is to show the part that the Gestapo and SD played in connection with those orders. Now, the next order that I introduce is document 498 PS in the first volume, U.S. Exhibit 501. Now, that is the celebrated commando order signed by the Führer himself on the 18th of October, 1942. There were only 12 copies of this made, and it bears the personal original signature of Adolf Hitler. And one copy was sent to the Reichsfuhrer SS and Chief of Security Police. That order, without reading it and to get down to the part from which I want to quote, simply provides that all commandos, whether in uniform or not, unarmed or not, are to be slaughtered to the last man. And I want to read down towards the bottom. It's paragraph 4. Beginning at the beginning of paragraph 4 to show the part of the SD. Quote, if individual members of such commandos, such as agents, saboteurs, etc., fall into the hands of the military forces by some other means, through the police in occupied territories, for instance, they are to be handed over immediately to the SD, unquote. Another one of those orders is 526 PS, U.S. Exhibit 502. The next one is 526 PS, to which I want to refer. That document has to do with some saboteurs, alleged saboteurs, landing in Norway, and it's dated the 10th of May, 1943, and it's top secret. And I quote the first paragraph as identifying a crew, quoting, on 30th March 1943, on Toftefjord, 70 degrees latitude, an enemy cutter was sighted. Cutter was blown up by the enemy. Crew, 2 dead men, 10 prisoners. That's the crew. And near the bottom of that order, the third sentence from the bottom is this statement. Führer order executed. You find it, John, it's 526. Yes.
Yes.
Near the bottom is the statement, quote, Führer order executed by SD, Security Service, unquote. We've heretofore introduced document R1110, R110, 110, U.S. Exhibit 333. And that was the Himmler order of 10th of August, 1943, which was sent to security police, and that order provided it was not the task of the police to interfere in clashes between Germans and English and American terror flyers who had bailed out. R110, and that was personally signed by Himmler himself. And here's his signature. That's been introduced in evidence, but I want to call the attention of the court to it again. Now, next go to the subject where the Gestapo and the SD took civilians of occupied countries to Germany for secret trial and punishment. That is the so-called Night and Fog Decree, issued on the 7th of December, 1941, by Hitler. In that decree has already been introduced. That has not been introduced in evidence. I now refer to document L90, L90 in the first volume. U.S. Exhibit 503. That decree, under which persons who committed offenses against the Reich or occupation forces in occupied countries, except where death sentence was certain, were to be taken secretly to Germany and surrendered to the security police and SD for trial or punishment in Germany itself. And this is the original from which we quote, beginning on the first page of the translation. It's addressed or from the Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, are on that stationery. Munich, 4th of February, 1942. Subject, prosecution of offenses against the Reich or the occupation forces. 1. The following regulations, published by the Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, dated 12 December 1941, are being made known herewith. 1. The Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. After thoughtful consideration, it is the will of the Führer that the measures taken against those who are guilty of offenses against the Reich or against the occupation forces in occupied areas should be altered. The Führer thinks that in the case of such offenses like imprisonment, even life imprisonment at hard labor is regarded as a sign of weakness. The only way to succeed in giving a lasting scare to the people is to decree the death penalty, or by taking measures which will leave the family and the population uncertain as to the fate of the offender. The deportation to Germany is just for this purpose. The directives for the prosecution of offenses, as outlined below, correspond with the Führer's conception. They have been examined and approved by him, signed Keitel. And then follows some of the directives and descriptions. Now then, we turn to next of that same document. It's a great-long document with enclosures. To page 4 of the English translation. Near the bottom. Quoting, insofar as the SS and police are the competent authorities for dealing with offenses committed under 1, they should proceed accordingly. Now next, in connection with the same document, on part 2 of the English translation, it's on page 2 of the second part. Which is a secret letter and was addressed to the Abwehr. I quote. It's on page 2 of the second part.
Yeah.
It's the letter of 2nd February 1942, and passing down to enclosed fine. Please find. 1. Decree of the Führer and the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of 7 December 1941. That was the order from which I just read. 2. Executive order of the same date. 3. Communication of the Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces of 12 December 1941. the decree introduces a fundamental innovation. The Führer and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces orders that offenses committed by civilians within the occupied territories and of the kind mentioned above are to be dealt with by the competent military courts in the occupied territories only if A, the death penalty is pronounced, and B, the sentence is pronounced within 8 days of the prisoner's arrest. Unless both these conditions are fulfilled, the Führer and the Supreme Commander does not anticipate that criminal proceedings within the occupied territories will have the necessary deterrent effect. In all other cases, the prisoners are in the future to be transported to Germany secretly, and further dealings with the offenses will take place here. These measures will have a deterrent because A, the prisoners will vanish without leaving a trace. B, no information may be given as to their whereabouts or their fate. Now, skipping the next paragraph to the second paragraph below, in case the competent military court responsible, the military commander, are of the opinion that an immediate decision on the spot is impossible, and the prisoners are therefore to be transported to Germany, the counterintelligence offices have to report this fact directly to the RSHA in Berlin, SW11, Prince Albrecht Street 7, care Dr. Fischer, Director of Criminal Police, stating the exact number of prisoners and of the groups which belong together as the case may be. Isolated cases where the superior commander has an urgent interest in the case being dealt with by a military court are to be reported to the RSHA. A copy of the entire report has to be sent to Office, Foreign Countries Intelligence Department, Abwehr 3. The RSHA, on the basis of available accommodation, will determine which office of the state police has to accept the prisoners. The latter office will communicate with the competent counterintelligence office and determine where with it the particulars of the removal, particularly whether this will be carried out by the secret field police, the field gendarmerie, or the Gestapo itself, as well as on place and the manner of actually handing over, unquote. After the civilians arrived in Germany, no word of the disposition of their cases was permitted to reach the country from which they came or their relatives. I now offer document 668 PS, U.S. Exhibit 504. This is a letter of the Chief of the Security Police and the SD, dated the 24th of June, 1942, 668 PS. And I quote from the first page of the English translation, the big paragraph, which is about the fourth or fifth. Quote, "It is the intent of the directive of the Führer and Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht concerning prosecution of criminal acts against the Reich or the occupation forces in occupied territories, dated December 7th, 1941. That's the order that I first referred to. To create, for deterrent purposes, uncertainty over the fate of prisoners among their relatives and acquaintances, through the deportation into Reich territory of persons arrested in occupied areas on account of activity inimical to Germany. This goal would be forfeited if the relatives were to be notified in cases of death. Release of the body for burial at home is inadvisable for the same reason, and beyond that also because the place of burial could be misused for demonstrations. I therefore propose that the following rules be observed in handling of cases of death. A. Notification of relatives is not to take place. B. The body will be buried at the place of decease in the Reich. C. The place of burial will, for the time being, not be made known. Unquote. Now, passing to the next activity of the SD and Gestapo, which was that they arrested, tried, and punished citizens of occupied countries under special criminal procedure and by summary methods. And I next offer in evidence document 674 PS, U.S. Exhibit 505. 674 PS. The Gestapo arrested, placed into protective custody, and executed civilians of occupied countries under certain circumstances, even where there were courts capable of handling emergency cases. The Gestapo conducted its own proceedings without regard to normal judicial processes. And this document, 674, is a letter from the chief public prosecutor at Katowice, dated the 3rd of December, 1941. And it's addressed to the Reich Minister of Justice, attention, Chief Counselor to the government, Stadtmann, or representative in office, Berlin. The subject is executions by the police and expediting of penal procedure without order. Enclosure is one copy of the report. I quote from the beginning. About 3 weeks ago, 6 chief agents, partially German, were hanged by the police in connection with the destruction of a treasonable organization of 350 members in Tarnowitz without justification of the Ministry of Justice, without notification of the Ministry of Justice. Such execution of criminal agents in the Beilitz district have already been made before, also without the knowledge of the proper authority for criminal prosecution. On 2nd December 1941, the head of the state police at Katowice, chief counselor to the government Milner, reported orally to the undersigned that he had ordered, with authority from the Reich leader of the SS, as necessary immediate action, these executions by public hanging at the place of the crime, and that deterring measures would also have to be continued in the future until the criminal and actively anti-German powers in occupied eastern territories have been destroyed, or until other immediate actions, perhaps also by the courts, would guarantee equal frightening effect. Accordingly, 6 leaders of another Polish organization guilty of high treason in the district in and around Sosnowitz were to be hanged publicly today as an example. About this procedure, the undersigned expressed considerable doubts. Besides the fact that such measures have been withdrawn from the jurisdiction of the ordinary courts and are contradictory to the laws not put out of effect, a justified emergency for the exceptional proceedings by the police alone cannot, in our opinion, be lawfully recognized. The penal justice in our district within the limits of our jurisdiction is quite capable of fulfilling its duty of immediate penal retribution. by means of a special form of special judicial activity, establishment of a so-called rapid special court. Indictment and proceeding could be speeded up in such a way that between turning the case over to the public prosecutor and the execution, no more than 3 days would elapse if the practice of pardoning is simplified and the decision, if necessary, can be obtained by long-distance call. This was expressed yesterday to the head of the state police at Katowice by the undersigned. We cannot believe that execution by the police of criminals, especially German criminals, can be considered more effective through shattering the sense of justice of many German countrymen. In the long run, they might, in spite of public terrorizing, lead even more to further brutality of minds, which is contrary to the intended purpose of pacifying. These deliberations, however, do not apply to future lawful competence of a drumhead court-martial for Poles and Jews. Unquote. I next refer to document 654 PS, U.S. Exhibit 218, which has previously been introduced in evidence, but it bears on this subject, and I'll simply summarize in a word what it provided. It states that on the 18th of September 1942, Theorak, the Reich Minister of Justice, and Himmler came to an understanding by which antisocial elements were to be turned over to Himmler to be worked to death. This is in document 654 PS. And a special criminal procedure was to be applied by the police to the Jews, the Poles, the Gypsies, Russians, and Ukrainians who were not to be tried in the ordinary criminal courts. I simply refer to that document as bearing on the same subject. Another document which I'll not quote from but cite to your honors is the order of November 5th, 1942, issued by the RSHA, and that is document L316, U.S. Exhibit 346. L316, and I don't think it's necessary to quote from that except to state that that letter provides that the administration of, in fact, the last statement in it, just before the signature, provides that the administration of penal law for the persons of alien race must be transferred from the hands of the administrators of justice into the hands of the police. That is the part that connects the police with it, and I'll not quote from the document otherwise. Now, I next come to the subject where the Gestapo and SD executed or confined persons in concentration camps for crimes allegedly committed by their relatives. And in that connection, I offer document L37 in the first volume, U.S. Exhibit 506. That is a letter dated the 19th of July, 1944. Call your honor's attention to the fact that it's dated in 1944. Sent by the commander of the CPO and SD for the district of Radom to the Foreign Service Office at Tomashaw. Parenthetically, that big hop book that we introduced in evidence has a number of cases in connection with the district of Radom, and Your Honor will remember that it is a list of the people in the district of Tomashaw. The subject of this letter is collective responsibility of members of families of assassins and saboteurs. I'll read after the word precedence. The Higher SS and Police Bureau Ost has issued on the 28th of June 1944 the following order. Quote, the security situation in the general government has in the last months grown worse to such an extent that from now on the most radical means and the harshest measures must prevail against the alien assassins and saboteurs. The Reichsfuhrer SS, in agreement with the general government, has ordered that in all cases in which attacks and attempts of assassinations against Germans have resulted, or saboteurs destroyed installations essential to life, not only the seized perpetrators be shot, but that because of it all, the men of the kin also be executed, and their female relatives who are over 16 years be put into concentration camps. Strict presumption is hereby taken for granted that if the perpetrator or the perpetrators are not seized, their names and addresses be readily ascertained. As male members of the kin can be considered, for example, the father, sons, insofar as they are over 16 years of age, brothers, brothers-in-law, cousins, and uncles of the perpetrator. Against the women, proceedings must take place in the same manner. With this procedure, it is intended to ensure a total liability of all men and women of the kin of the perpetrator. It furthermore affects to the utmost the family circle of the political criminal. This practice has shown, for example, already at the end of 1939, the best results in the new Eastern Territories, especially in the Warthe district. As soon as this new method for combating assassins and saboteurs, I beg your pardon.
Yes, go on.
Becomes known to these foreign people, this may be achieved by oral propaganda. The female members of a kin in which members of the resistance movement or bands are present, as shown by experience, will exert a curbing influence, unquote. Now, the SD and Gestapo also conducted third-degree interrogations of prisoners of war, and I refer to document 1531 PS, U.S. Exhibit 248. This document contains an order of the 12th June 1942 signed by Muller, 1531 in the second volume, which authorized the use of third-degree methods in interrogations where preliminary investigation indicated that the prisoner could give information on important facts such as subversive activities, but not to extort confessions of the prisoner's own crimes. Now, I quote from page 2, paragraph Page 2 of the English translation, paragraph 2. Third degree may, under this supposition, only be employed against communists, Marxists, Jehovah's Witnesses, saboteurs, terrorists, members of resistance movements, parachute agents, antisocial elements, Polish, are Soviet, Russian loafers, or tramps. In all other cases, my permission must first be obtained. Then I pass to paragraph 4 at the end. Third degree can, according to the circumstances, consist, amongst other methods, of hard bunk, dark cell, deprivation of sleep, exhaustive drilling, also in flogging, in paren, for more than 20 strokes, a doctor must be consulted. Close of paren. On the 24th of February, 1944, the commander of the SIPO and SD for the district of Radom published an order issued by the Befehlshaber of the SIPO and the SD at Krakow, which is Exhibit L89, U.S. Exhibit 507. L89 in the first volume. And this followed closely the provisions of the previous decree that I've just quoted from, and I quote the first paragraph after the list of officers on the first page. Quoting, "In view of the variety of methods used to date in intensified interrogations, and in order to avoid excesses, also to protect officials against eventual criminal proceedings, the Befehlshaber of the Security Police and of the SD in Krakow has issued the following order for the Security Police in the general government, which is based on the regulations in force for the Reich," unquote. And then the regulations are quoted. And the significance of this document is that it proves, as late as 1944, third-degree interrogations were still being conducted by the Gestapo. I next pass to the activity of the Gestapo and SD as being primary agencies for the persecution of the Jews, and I do not intend to go into any of the evidence previously introduced except to refer to the part of these organizations. The responsibility of the Gestapo and SD for the mass extermination program carried out by the Einsatzgruppen of the SIPO and SD, and in the annihilation camps to which the Jews were sent by the SIPO and SD, has already been considered, and I simply cite the tribunal to document 2615 PS, which has previously been introduced, and in which it was referred to the number of Jews executed and referred to by Eichmann. And I simply call attention that Eichmann was head of Section B4 of the Gestapo. And that section of the Gestapo dealt with the Jewish affairs, including matters of evacuation, means of suppressing enemies of the people and the state, and the dispossession of rights of German citizenship. The Gestapo was also charged with the enforcement of discriminatory laws, which have heretofore been introduced. I now invite Your Honor's attention to document 3058 PS, U.S. Exhibit 508. 3058 PS. That I'd like to exhibit to Your Honors is a red-bordered document signed by Heydrich himself and addressed to the defendant Goering. And it's dated the 11th of November, 1938. I pass this to the reporter, and before it's passed to the reporter, there is an appendix attached to it to the effect that the matter had been called to the attention of the defendant Gary. Now, this concerns a report of activities of the Gestapo in connection with the anti-Jewish demonstration, you'll recall, on in the fall of 1938. And this is a report from Heydrich himself personally to the defendant Gary. It's addressed to the Prime Minister, General Field Marshal Gary, and dated the 15th of November, 1938. And the previous documents showed that that activity occurred just before, and the order for it in connection with the Jewish uprising or extermination. Quoting, "The extent of the destruction of Jewish shops and houses cannot yet be verified by figures. The figures given in the reports, 815 shops destroyed, 171 dwelling houses set on fire or destroyed, only indicate a fraction of the actual damage caused as far as arson is concerned. Due to the urgency of the reporting, the reports received to date are entirely limited to general statements such as numerous or most shops destroyed. Therefore, the figures given must have been exceeded considerably. 191 synagogues were set on fire, and another 76 completely destroyed. In addition, 11 parish halls."
You're going too fast. Yes.
"Cemetery chapels and similar buildings were set on fire, and 3 more completely destroyed. 20,000 Jews were arrested. Also 7 Aryans and 3 foreigners. The latter were arrested for their own safety. 36 deaths were reported, and those seriously injured were also numbered at 36. Those killed and injured are Jews. 1 Jew still missing. The Jews killed include 1 Polish national, and those injured include 2 Poles." Now, the paper appended to that document, I want to call your honors a special attention to. Quoting, "The General Field Marshal," it's on the other page, I'm sorry. "The General Field Marshal, that's Goering, has been informed no steps are to be taken by order," and dated the 15th of November, 1938, by an illegible signature. Now, in that same connection, Heydrich was charged by the defendant Gary with this entire program, and we next offer in evidence the original of that order, 710 PS, document 710 PS, U.S. Exhibit 509. And that's an order dated the 31st of July, 1941, document 710 PS. It's written on the stationery of the Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, Commissioner for the 4-year Plan, Chairman of the Ministerial Council for National Defense, and it's dated at Berlin, the 31st of July, 1941, and directed to the Chief of the Security Police and the Security Service, SS Gruppenführer Heydrich, complementing the task that was assigned to you on 24 January 1939, which dealt with arriving at, through furtherance of immigration and evacuation, a solution of the Jewish problem as advantageous as possible, I hereby charge you with making all necessary preparations in regard to organizational and financial matters for bringing about a complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Wherever other government agencies are involved, these are to cooperate with you. I charge you furthermore to send me, before long, an overall plan concerning the organizational, factual, and material measures necessary for the accomplishment of the desired solution of the Jewish question, signed Graebe. The tribunal has already received the evidence as to what the final solution of the Jewish problem was, as conceived by Heydrich and executed by the security police and SD under him and under the defendant, Kaltenbrunn, which was enslavement and mass murder. Now, finally, in this presentation, the last activity of the Gestapo and SD to which I will refer is that these organizations were the primary agencies for the persecution of the churches. Already evidence has been received concerning the persecution of the churches. In this struggle, the Gestapo and the SD played a secret but very highly significant part. Section C2 of the SD dealt with education and religious life. Section B1 of the Gestapo dealt with political Catholicism. Section B2 with political Protestantism. And Section B3 with other churches and Freemasonry. The church was one of the enemies of the Nazi state, and it was a peculiar function of the Gestapo to combat it. It issued restrictions against church activities, dissolved church organizations, and placed clergymen in protective custody. I now want to offer in evidence document 1815 PS, U.S. Exhibit 510. Now, this is a very large file, this original document. And I want to quote only portions of it. This was a file of the Gestapo regional office at Aachen. It discloses the purpose of the Gestapo in combating the churches was to destroy them. And from the beginning, I want to read, that's the first page. First page of the English translation, 1815. Dated the 12th of May, 1941 at Berlin, from the RSHA, Section 4B1. To all Staatspolizei Leitstellen for information, the SD Leit Abschnitten, the inspectors of the SIPO and SD. I understand this word abschnitten means subdivision. The subject is concerning the study and treatment of church politics. The chief of the RSHA has issued an order which is to come into immediate operation, in which the SIPO and SD study, in which the SD and SIPO study and treatment of church politics, which has heretofore been divided between the SD, Abschnitt, and Staatspostellen, shall now be taken entirely by the Stabsstellen, which I understand means regional offices of the Gestapo. And it refers to the plan for the division of work issued by RSHA on March 1st, 1941. In addition to combating opposition, the Stabsstellen thus take over the entire, and I understand that word means counterintelligence, in this sphere. In order that the Stabsstellen should be in a position to take over this work, the chief of the SIPO SD has ordered that church specialists hitherto employed in the SD Abschnitten should be temporarily transferred to the same post at the regional Gestapo offices and operate which means intelligence service in the church. On the orders of the chief of the RSHA, and after reaching agreement with the heads of OMPs 3, 2, and 1, those church specialists specified in the attached list.
Is it necessary to give us details of this?
No, sir, I don't think so. If I might, well, anyhow, if Your Honors please, we quote from it, and it is simply a direction as to how they'll proceed. Now, then later, on the 22nd and 23rd of September 1941, they called a conference of these so-called church specialists attached to the Gestapo regional offices that I've mentioned, and it was held in the lecture hall of the RSHA in Berlin. And notes were taken, and this same document contains notes of that conference. And the program is shown. The plan is worked out in connection with the churches, and I'll just read the closing statement to these so-called church specialists. It's very short. Each one of you must go to work with your whole heart and true fanaticism. Should a mistake or two be made in the execution of this work, it should in no way discourage you, since mistakes are made everywhere. The main thing is that the enemy, meaning the church, should be constantly tackled with determination, will, and effective initiative. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to refer to in this document, which is on the 8th page of the English translation, which sets out their immediate aim and their ultimate aim. It's on page 8 of the English translation. The immediate aim: the church must not regain 1 inch of the ground it has lost. The ultimate aim: destruction of the confessional churches, to be brought about by the collection of all material obtained through Nachrichtendienst activities, which will at a given time be produced as evidence for the charge of treasonable activities during the German fight for existence. Unquote. I understand that long German word means intelligence activities. Now, if Your Honors please, this concludes the factual documentary presentation which I shall make in connection with the SD and Gestapo. But closely allied with it is the case against Kaltenbrunner as a representative of these organizations, which will be presented immediately after lunch by Lieutenant Whitney Harris, and also there will be 1 or 2 witnesses that will be introduced in connection with these organizations and in connection with Kaltenbrunner. And with that, I should like to conclude with just these remarks. The evidence shows that the Gestapo was created by the defendant Goering in Prussia in April 1933 for the specific purpose of serving as a police agency to strike down the actual and ideological enemies of the Nazi regime. and that henceforward the Gestapo in Prussia and in the other states of the Reich carried out a program of terror against all who thought to be dangerous to the domination of the conspirators over the people of Germany. Its methods were utterly ruthless. It operated outside the law, and it sent its victims to the concentration camps. The term Gestapo became the symbol of the Nazi regime of force and terror. Behind the scenes, operating secretly, the SD, through its vast network of informants, spied upon the German people in their daily lives, on the streets, in the shops, and even within the sanctity of the churches. The most casual remark of the German citizen might bring him before the Gestapo, where his fate and freedom were decided without recourse to law. In this government, in which the rule of law was replaced by a tyrannical rule of men, the Gestapo was the primary instrumentality of oppression. The Gestapo and SD played an important part in almost every criminal act of the conspiracy. The category of these crimes, apart from the thousands of specific instances of torture and cruelty in policing Germany for the benefit of the conspirators, reads like a page from the Devil's Notebook. They fabricated the border incidents which Hitler used as an excuse for attacking Poland. They murdered hundreds of thousands of defenseless men, women, and children by the infamous Einsatzgruppen. They removed Jews, political leaders, and scientists from prisoners of war camps and murdered them. They took recaptured prisoners of war to concentration camps and murdered them. They established and classified the concentration camps and sent thousands of people into them for extermination and slave labor. They cleared Europe of the Jews and were responsible for sending hundreds of thousands to their deaths in annihilation camps. They rounded up hundreds of thousands of citizens of occupied countries and shipped them to Germany for forced labor, and sent slave laborers to labor reformatory camps. They executed captured commandos and paratroopers and protected civilians who lynched Allied flyers. They took civilians of occupied countries to Germany for secret trial and punishment. They arrested, tried, and punished citizens of occupied countries under special criminal procedures which did not accord fair trials and by summary methods. They murdered and sent to concentration camps the relatives of persons who had allegedly committed crimes. They ordered the murder of prisoners in SIPO and SD prisons to prevent their release by Allied armies. They participated in the seizure and spoliation of public and private property. They were primary agencies for the persecution of the Jews in churches. In carrying out these crimes, the Gestapo operated as an organization closely centralized and controlled from Berlin headquarters. Reports were submitted to Berlin, and all important decisions emanated from Berlin. The regional offices had only limited power to commit persons to concentration camps. All cases other than short of duration had to be submitted to Berlin for approval. The Gestapo was organized on a functional basis. Its principal divisions dealt with groups and institutions against which it committed the worst crimes, which I've enumerated. Thus, in perpetrating these crimes, the Gestapo acted as an entity, each section performing its part in the general criminal enterprises ordered by Berlin. The secret state police should be held responsible as an organization for the vast crimes in which it participated. The SD at all times was a department of the SS. Its criminality directly concerns and contributes to the criminality of the SS. And as to the Gestapo, it is submitted, one, that it was an organization in the sense in which that term is used in Article 9 of the Charter, and the defendants Goering and Kaltenbrunner committed crimes defined in Article 6 of the Charter in their capacity as members and leaders of the Gestapo. The Gestapo as an organization participated in and aided the conspiracy, which contemplated and involved the commission of the crimes defined in Article 6 of the Charter. And finally, I have in my hand here a brochure published in honor of the famous Heydrich, the former chief of the security police and SD. And I quote from his speech delivered therein, which was delivered by Heydrich on German Police Day 1941, as follows, of which I ask the tribunal to take judicial notice. Quote, secret state police, criminal police, and SD are still adorned with the furtive and whispered secrecy of a political detective story. In a mixture of fear and shuddering, and yet at home with a certain feeling of security because of their presence, brutality, inhumanity, bordering on the sadistic, and ruthlessness are attributed abroad to the men of this profession, unquote. And those are the words of Heydrich, who was the former head of this organization. Does Your Honor want to go ahead with Could I make just one statement in connection with that,
Yes.
please?
Certainly.
The evidence against Kaltenbrunner will be in connection with the part he played in these organizations. And we thought, in the interest of time, the individual case against Kaltenbrunner could be presented at the same time. Now, if it were not presented in this connection, it would be within a few days, early next week, in connection with the other individual defendants. And counsel mentions that he probably will not be able to be here for some time, and I thought I would make that statement.